There is a moment that happens quietly, with no announcement and no celebration, when the number in your investment account crosses $100,000 and something fundamental shifts in how money behaves around you. Most people who reach this point don't fully understand what just changed, and that gap in understanding is exactly why so many of them slow down right when the system is about to begin working in a completely different way. To understand why this number matters, you have to first understand something about how compounding actually operates in real life, not as an abstract concept written in a textbook, but as a mechanical force that is deeply sensitive to the size of the base it's working from. When your invested balance is small, compounding exists mathematically, but it is nearly invisible in practical terms. A 10% return on $5,000 produces $500, which feels like a minor footnote compared to the monthly contributions you are making manually. Your own labor, your own income, your own discipline is doing the heavy lifting, and the market is barely contributing. This dynamic begins to change gradually as the balance grows, but the change is not linear, and that is the part most people misunderstand. The relationship between your contributions and your returns is not a steady shift, it is a threshold phenomenon, and $100,000 is where many investors begin to feel that threshold for the first time in a meaningful way. At that balance, a 10% annual return produces $10,000, which begins to resemble real monthly income in a way that smaller balances simply cannot replicate. You are no longer just saving. The machine has started to contribute alongside you. The behavioral economics research on this point is particularly revealing. Studies in financial psychology have consistently shown that the way people perceive and interact with their money changes substantially once they cross certain cognitive thresholds, and six figures is among the most psychologically significant. Below that number, most people are operating in a scarcity mindset, even when they are technically making progress, because the gap between where they are and where they imagine wealth to begin still feels enormous. The moment the balance reads 100,000, something shifts in self-perception, in patience, and in decision-making quality, and those psychological shifts have compounding effects of their own. There is also a mathematical reality embedded in this threshold that deserves close attention. The journey to the first $100,000 is, by almost every measure, the hardest part of the long-term wealth-building process. Not because the habits are harder, but because the ratio of effort to visible progress is at its most discouraging. If you invest $500 per month with a 7% average annual return, it takes roughly 9 to 10 years to reach $100,000. The second $100,000, however, arrives in approximately 5 to 6 years, even if you never increase your contributions by a single dollar. The third arrives faster still, and by the time you are approaching $500,000, the market is contributing more to your annual growth than your monthly deposits are. This acceleration is not luck, and it is not a special circumstance available only to certain people. It is the mechanical output of a mathematical system that rewards patience and punishes exit. The reason the first 100,000 is so psychologically significant is precisely because it marks the transition from a phase where you are the primary engine of growth to a phase where the compounding mechanism begins to carry increasing weight. You shift, gradually and then unmistakably, from being the contributor to being the manager of a system that works independently of your daily effort. What makes this threshold particularly interesting from a systemic perspective is how few people fully remain invested long enough to experience it. The research on investor behavior shows that the average retail investor significantly underperforms market indices, not because they chose bad assets, but because they exit during downturns, pause contributions during periods of financial stress, and restructure their portfolios in ways that reset the compounding clock. The $100,000 milestone is meaningful in part because reaching it requires surviving those psychological exit points, which are most intense precisely in the early years when returns are least visible and doubt is most available. Understanding this should reframe how you think about the early phase of investing entirely. The years before 100,000 are not a warm-up period. They are the most structurally important years of the entire process because the habits, the patience, and the resistance to panic that you build in that phase are what determine whether you stay invested long enough for the system to shift in your favor. Every month of consistent contribution during a flat or declining market is not wasted time. It is the foundational architecture that the later acceleration is built on. There is a parallel in financial history worth noting here. The investors who accumulated generational wealth through the 20th century were not, as a group, people who made dramatically better investment decisions than their peers. What the data consistently shows is that they were people who made adequate decisions and held them through multiple cycles of fear and uncertainty. The compounding advantage accrues disproportionately to duration, and duration is a behavioral achievement before it is a financial one. When you finally cross 100,000, the practical implication is this: your relationship with volatility should change. A 10% market decline on a $50,000 portfolio represents a $5,000 paper loss that can feel devastating and meaningful. A 10% decline on a $200,000 portfolio represents a $20,000 paper fluctuation, which sounds worse numerically, but the investor who understands compounding reads that moment differently. They understand that the same recovery mechanism that built the balance will rebuild whatever the market temporarily removes, and that patience during that period is not passive, it is a productive financial act. This is ultimately what the $100,000 threshold represents at its deepest level. It is not just a number on a screen. It is the point where the financial system begins to reveal its internal logic to the person who has stayed present long enough to see it. The returns become more visible. The math becomes more tangible. The patience that once felt like sacrifice begins to feel like strategy. And the identity shift that comes with that realization, the shift from someone who is trying to build wealth to someone who understands how wealth builds itself, is not cosmetic. It changes the decisions you make, the risks you take, and the timelines you are willing to commit to. The first 100,000 is hard because it is supposed to be. It is the entry fee to a different relationship with money. One where your capital begins to work in parallel with your effort, rather than entirely dependent on it. And once that shift happens, the math does not reset, it compounds. If this video gave you a clearer picture of how the compounding system actually works, the best thing you can do right now is share it with someone who is still in that early phase, still grinding toward their first milestone, still wondering if the effort is worth it. Because the most valuable thing you can give someone at that stage is not advice, it is perspective. Subscribe if you want to keep understanding the systems behind money rather than just the surface of it, because that's all we do here, and there is a great deal more worth understanding.